Hello and welcome to Critical Readings, episode 333 for the 27th of July, 2026. I'm Dr. Sean Philip Cooper, and with me today I have Dr. Drew Nathaniel Keene
Salutations.
and Lane Haygood.
Hello.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Well, we have learned some important knowledge, or I have learned some important knowledge from last week's brief technical difficulty. So we fixed the audio. I'm coming in stereo, and we have all of our video sorted. I think we might actually have it down pat, he said. Knock on wood, or glass on top of wood, or simulated wood, or whatever my desk is made of. So now we're going to move on to this week's episode. But before we do that, we do have some comments from the last 2 weeks, episodes 331 and 332, which were both about the beginning of the ill-made knight, being the third of the 4 parts of the Once and Future King. And back in episode 331, Philip wrote in. And he wrote to say, "Thank you again for more than delivering on the promise of debates over might versus right and nonviolence. Loved it. Since I didn't get my comments for episodes 329 and 330 written up before the recording of this episode, I wanted to say a brief word about those and make a short plug for a book which listeners who enjoyed the robust, insightful conversations from that episode might also want to try. First, I appreciate the overarching discussions in the episodes about the tensions between the systemic and the individual, whether it's indeed bad actors or intentionally designed systems or both, which lead to social ills, war, etc. White gives us plenty of tinder to stoke these philosophical conversations, especially the relationship between the Little Englander mentality and the imperial conscience remains relevant to this day. The discussions about just war and manufactured starvation, is there really any other kind, feels extra resonant after living here in Ireland. Thanks to Lane also for going to bat for the Irish. There's plenty to commend in these episodes, but I will keep it short and simply say that I found these perhaps the most engaging and thought-provoking of the pod. In no small part, I think, owing to how much was contextualizing White in the politics of his time, making it feel like a discussion I'd have in my MA program. Orwell and Inside the Whale come to mind. I think they'd be interesting to be paired together, especially considering how dismissive Orwell was of early 20th century Little Englanders. Lastly, the book recommendation. The Pacifist Conscience, edited by Peter Meyer, is a collection of literature on pacifism and nonviolence spanning from the 6th century BC to the late 1960s, that's AD. It was published in 1966 and is much more nuanced than what White gives us, though there is still some moralistic finger-wagging to be found. I've had this one for long years and often come back to it, mainly when wrangling with questions of when, if, and how we should use force. While there's nothing from White in it, I wonder whether he might have read the letters contained therein between Einstein and Freud, Why War, published in 1933. Besides this, what I think would make insightful supplementary reading to these episodes are William James, The Moral Equivalent of War, Diedrich H. Lund, Pacifism Under Occupation, and Richard Gregg, Moral Jiu-Jitsu. For even further reading, I can definitely recommend 2 articles, one quite old, one new. 1. Making War Illegal Changed the World, but It's Becoming Too Easy to Break the Law, in The Guardian, 2017. When I read it at the time, it was eye-opening to see a long read in a mainstream news publication about states having monopoly over the legitimate use of force. Rereading in 2026 brings home how little has changed in the intervening years. And 2. Cas Mud. Until the mainstream inspires, far right's defeats are just temporary interruptions. Vox Europe 2026. This was run last week, discussing why it's not enough that extremism is defeated, but that it will continue to exist as long as mainstream parties fail to understand the grievances that brought it to power, and as long as democracy is defended only as a barrier rather than offered as a project. Well, thank you, Philip, for that reading list. I'm sure that some of our readers will find this very interesting and helpful, and we appreciate your comments, and certainly we appreciate the compliments as well. It's nice to hear that our podcast is delivering on the kind of feeling one expects in the college classroom. All right. Well,
I would point out
go ahead.
all of those reading suggestions though are really from an idealist point of view. They're all from a liberal point of view. rather than a materialist point of view, which would be much more on the systemic side of things, seeing ideas as emerging out of particular material conditions.
Indeed. Well,
so even if they have disagreements with White, they're of the same kind
yeah,
as White.
they're kind of proceeding from the same intellectual foundation. Drew, would you have a suggestion for an alternative reading to season the pot?
I thought you might ask me that. I'll have to think about that and get back next time.
All right. Well, we have some other comments. These are on episode 332, which was last week's episode. And that was on chapters 9 through 18 of The Ill-Made Knight, which leads up to Lancelot leaping out of a window in a fit of madness when Guinevere confronts him and Elaine. Lane said, truly a chevalier mal fait. Charlie said, I find Jenny's criticism of Arthur waging war while trying to subdue might in the kingdom a misunderstanding of Arthur as a man instead of a king. Arthur's responsibility as the government to have a monopoly on violence is wholly separate from an individual's desire to exercise might. I am not sure if White's pacifism denies a government the use of violence, or if he is showing Jenny's naivete. Well, that's a very good comment, Charlie. And I think you're onto something, because we do get, it's the beginning of chapter 25, when Lancelot and Arthur, it begins with them basically on the balustrade of the castle, and they're looking down at people fighting, basically practicing their archery. And Lancelot says something about an arrow thrilling in its target, and Arthur responds, we don't see much of that anymore. Arrows thrilling in their targets, and vibrating in the heart of a man. And Lancelot says, well, isn't that what you're meant to be doing? Are we supposed to be stopping all this? And then Arthur changes the subject. And I think that's interesting. Remember that when Arthur was all the way back with Merlin, how excited he was about the idea of fighting as a knight. And even as a young king, in The Sword and the Stone, and in the second book, The Queen of Air and Darkness, we see an Arthur who likes to fight. He enjoys combat, and he's very good at it. So he's an excellent fighter, and he enjoys martial prowess, as Mallory would put it. Part of this is probably because White is using Mallory, and Arthur in Le Morte Arthur enjoys fighting, and he's a good knight, because that's the Mallorean view of knighthood. So if you're going to have a perfect king, as you do in the form of Arthur, then he has to behave, to the limit of what that knighthood entails. And for Mallory, that's martial prowess. So part of that is there, but I think it lingers. I think we see an Arthur in the beginning of this Lancelot book who still has some lingering appreciation for combat as such. And Jenny doesn't quite get that. She wants to understand. She's trying to understand. And she probably thinks she does understand. But there's that king's two bodies problem going on in the background. So I think you're quite right to catch on that. Well done.
She's also the only character who sort of directly points out Arthur's contradiction. He talks all the time about wanting to end the philosophy of might makes right, and he thinks that idea is the cause of so much of the problem. And she points out, yes, but you love fighting.
Exactly.
He has these contradictions.
Now, of course, as we'll see in next week's episode, this eventually causes a very serious problem, and Arthur is forced to confront it by violence in the round table. But not this week. This week we're going to be focused on Lancelot. All right. Lane writes, per Dr. Keene, I'm not sure White's pacifism is a coherent thought, so much as it is an almost emotivist reaction to violence. White knows he has a negative emotional reaction to violence, but he hasn't thought through the consequences or necessity of a state monopoly on violence to enforce it, the same way an otherwise naive pacifist might not recognize the need for defensive war against an aggressor to preserve peace. Likewise, I don't think Arthur has thought through his plan other than to give outlets for violence that he thinks are positive, slaying dragons, rescuing maidens fair, jousting, while avoiding the outlets he thinks are bad, skirmishes between his vassals. Maybe there is some point there that none of our theories about violence and its just and unjust uses are sufficiently mature, but I haven't been convinced that's the point yet. Well, that's exactly on the same line, and you're quite right there, Lane. These are significant problems, and I'm sure you know now, since you've done the reading, that next week, this is where White attempts to deal with that. And he says, you're quite right, Lane. It's not enough to have simply an outlets for violence. We need to address the root causes.
But he always thinks that the root causes are ideas, bad ideas,
Yes.
or bad actors.
I think that's right. Although, well, we'll talk about it next week, but hang on to that idea for a week, Drew. Disa writes, "It seems to me now, after reading further, that it is not just Lancelot considering himself ugly. Other people are commenting on it, but women still fall for him like flies, so maybe it is of a kind men consider ugly, but women find fascinating." And before I respond to that, Disa, there was a similar comment on our discussion forums for Once and Future King, and I wanted to read that because we also had that comment as well. And we have a readings forum on our Discord where people can have like a sort of back and forth chat about this. And one of the comments was from Marissa this week, and she commented similarly. She said, "I just listened to the latest episode. It was great as always, and I would like to defend Lancelot a little." Buckle your breastplate, Drew. "I have to admit that this is the first time I've read The Ill-Made Knight, and as a standalone character, I have to agree that he is not the most likable. What I've always found fascinating about the character of Lancelot in general is the contrast between him being the best knight in the world, immensely admired, courageous, and always the winner, and on an emotional and spiritual level, rather pathetic, fearful, and weak. He clearly struggles with self-image issues and is plagued by feelings of inadequacy. This incongruity may also be why he is described as exceedingly ugly, yet very elegant and even beautiful when it comes to fighting and jousting, etc. Regarding his ugliness, I think he is not nearly as ugly as he thinks he is. The reflective surface Lancelot uses to look at himself in one of the first chapters is one that, quote, did not make a good mirror, end quote, which implies a distorted sense of how he perceives himself. White described his childhood as dysfunctional, to say the least, with distant parents and a borderline abusive uncle. It does not seem like he had many friends because he was always training. This seems to have left him rather emotionally stunted. The only way he can be worth something in his eyes is to be the best knight in the world. Only then can he gain respect and love from the people around him. It does not seem crazy to me that he turns out to be ruthlessly ambitious and not a little self-obsessed. It seems to me that he is just desperate for approval and love. He wants Arthur to love him. Although these character traits are a little exaggerated, I think many people can relate to them on some level." Well, I think that's quite right. And in response to both of you, I have this comment that regarding his ugliness, and I think I may have said this back on the very first episode for The Ill-Made Knight, or maybe it was the last episode of the previous book. But in any case, we never see anyone mention his ugliness when he's a child. We see lots of people mention his ugliness when he's an adult, when he's a grown man in the court. And we'll see it a great deal in this episode, because he goes mad and people are talking about him and remembering him, and they describe how ugly he was. And even in the next episode, as we approach the quest of the Holy Grail, people see glimpses of Lancelot and they mention his ugliness. Even the narrator describes him as ugly. But when he's a child, in the opening chapters of this book, book 3, he's never described as ugly except in his own head. It's when he's looking in that it's an upturned helmet, I think, right? That's the object that doesn't make a good mirror. It gives a distorted image. And he's looking in this distorted mirror and seeing this image of himself, and he thinks there's something wrong with it. And this is where I wonder if White is messing with us the way that he does with Arthur and his lectures, dreams, imaginings of being an animal. White is deliberately ambiguous because he doesn't actually tell us that Lancelot is ugly. But Lancelot believes he's ugly. Granted, he's looking in a bad mirror. Is there something really wrong with them? Is it the mirror? Is it purely psychological? If there is something wrong with him and he's really ugly, does this damage him in such a way that it affects his internal conception of himself? He sees an ugly outward image and it changes him internally as well. It needn't, right? There's no reason that your outward image, your outward appearance should determine your psychology. But maybe the tragedy of it is that he's so young that it does. Or conversely, you could say the opposite. If there is nothing truly wrong with him and he sees something wrong with him, he has this dysmorphic view of his appearance, then there's something really tragic about that. That he finds a way then to make his outward appearance conform to the distorted, gross image that he has in his mind. And he becomes truly ugly, not merely, dysmorphically ugly in the mind, but he manages to create an outward image that other people identify as ugly as well. And if that's the case, then that's a tragic end to Lancelot, and maybe the reason why so many other bad things happen to him as well. What do you think, Lane? I'm going to turn it to Lane because he's our Freudian. Is he really ugly as a child?
After this week's readings, no, I don't think so. I think that's just his internalization of something for some reason.
And he becomes ugly over time to match it.
But it's and we'll see that in today's discussion. It's his ugliness is temporary. It's a guise he puts on.
Is it? Well, I mean, when he's out in his madness running around, they discuss seeing him, and he's an ugly man. But the reason they're able to sort of identify him is because they say he was the ugliest man I ever knew, right? So it must be him.
I think this is quite important because we have previously talked about things the narrator says about him, which could be reflective of what he thinks about himself. We've heard things that he said about himself, which might not be objectively the case. And we've heard things that people said about his appearance to him, which again might be reflecting back to him what he says or thinks about himself. But in chapter 19 is the first time we have two characters discussing Lancelot without him present. And the king says, he was the ugliest man I've ever seen. So I think that's significant in saying whatever he might have looked like as a child, as an adult, when Arthur knew him, he was quite ugly.
So he's become ugly. And then
perhaps we just don't know much about what he looked like as a child because he's the only one that tells us about his childhood.
And should we trust Arthur's assessment of his looks, given that he's a romantic rival?
Well, that's a good point too. But
I don't think
other
that
characters
Arthur
say this
ever
as well.
Arthur never seems to regard Lancelot as a romantic rival. That's one of the odd things about this love triangle is that
one time, don't forget, there's a tournament at Westminster where he loses his temper.
That's true. Yeah.
He really does fight, and the result is he gets unhorsed by Lancelot. Lancelot's still a better knight. So I wonder about this. And I think this is what White does. He gives us these ambiguities and then deliberately makes it so you can't really pin it down. We can't know what Lancelot really looked like as a child because no one describes him as a child except for him. And his vision is maybe psychologically distorted. And the device he's using to look at himself is absolutely distorted. I mean, the narrator tells us that. So we're left with inadequate information to know.
On the point, though, about someone who is not physically attractive being the kind of person that draws other people, that is attractive in other ways. I mean, that is a phenomenon we see in other literary works. I think I mentioned in a previous episode Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind is described as not especially attractive physically, and yet incredibly attractive to everyone around her, like a magnet. And Plutarch says something similar about Cleopatra. She wasn't exceptionally beautiful, but she was exceptionally charismatic and drew people to her. I think
Absolutely.
that's the case for Lancelot.
His success and almost nonchalance about it uh, are appealing on their own and make people want to be around him.
Now, it's this idea of Lancelot as ugly, I think, is one of White's most brilliant moves, because there is no other depiction of Lancelot like this.
No.
And he's taken something from the tradition, the idea of the ill-made knight, which is not about appearance, and he's sort of reified it. He's made it a physical thing. This is how he's ill-made in the sense that he's sort of ugly, which I think is a really clever twist on the tradition.
There's nothing
But
else
it's
like it.
the adaptations of White, or depictions in cinema and shows that are based or inspired by White, have never picked up on this. So you don't get, you get Franco Nero as Lancelot, which is supposed to be based on T.H. White.
Yeah, and nothing nothing could be further from White, really.
Right.
It's yeah, not at all correct. There really is nothing like it, and it is a complete inversion of a central aspect of the character. Lancelot is normally described as extraordinarily handsome, right? All the women fall in love with him at sight. Really, they don't even have to know who he is, and when they know who he is, that really seals the deal, right? But even when they see him in disguise, as he so often is in Le Morte d'Arthur, people are instantly attracted to him. So he's very attractive to look at. White changes this and says, it's his movements in combat that are attractive, right? And he likes to use cricket terminology, like the leg glide, right? And the forward defensive. These are cricket maneuvers. And if you're a cricket fan like I am, then you come to appreciate. In fact, there's a cricket bat in the background in my video right there. So, you come to appreciate a really well executed cut or a forward defensive stroke. And there is a certain, the word is often used classical. There's a certain classical beauty to them. So I think that's how White does this. And that's a clever thing, right? That no one else has ever done this. They've always just taken it very literally. It's just physical appearance. But no, White says it's not physical appearance at all. His physical appearance is ugly. It's his expertise. Mallory would probably be approving of this in a way because it's his prowess. His prowess is so good that just the sight of it is enough to win the hearts of women and men alike. We have one more comment, and that is from Mao. And Mao writes, I think one of my big issues with The Once and Future King is that it can be very hard to tell if White is making a joke or not when he makes these sweeping generalizations. When I first read the line saying that made marriages tend to go well, I read it as mocking the idea of arranged marriages, not agreeing with them. But after the prolonged study of the text, maybe I was wrong to read it as a joke. And then there was also the idea brought up of Plantagenets having good, clean wars. And that's such a ridiculous statement. It would baffle me if White actually thought that. But he is so chauvinistic throughout the text that maybe he really isn't joking and actually believed these things. White seems tremendously well read, but sometimes severely uncritical of his readings. On a related point, White's hibernophobia also has the feel of this. Is he just trying to describe the racial blood hatred between people at the time, or is it his authorial voice? If the former, reading 19th century scientific racism centuries back to the medieval age is strange. The medievals could absolutely be bigoted, but it is highly doubtful they had the same ideas of nationalism that White is clearly reaching towards for the English-Celtic feud to work as an element of the story. Now, as for the ill-made knight, Sean's reading in the last episode was fantastic. It does get to the heart of what made the book work for me. I can forgive White skipping over how Lancelot and Guinevere fell in love because of the drama of the relationship is so well done. I'm looking forward to the probably brief, since it's brief in the text as well, touching on Galahad. I think Galahad is actually handled well as this kind of ghost in the narrative we almost never see, but mostly hear about. Arthur really tries to channel the knight's energies in a productive way, but the problem is the path leads out of the corrupt material world and somewhere else, so it can't actually help Arthur's situation. Final note. I am disheartened by White referring to Bors as the misogynist, like that's his title. It's not fair. Bors is not such a bad sort. I don't remember him distinctly hating women in Mallory. I wonder if White was drawing from some other text for this. Really enjoying the podcast. Good health to the panel. And thank you, Lane, for your description of legendary spears I was not aware of, specifically the ones from the Bhagavad Gita. I believe the Chinese do refer to the spear as the king of weapons, while the saber is the general of weapons, and the straight sword the gentleman of weapons. I suppose it does come down to the sword's sign as a status symbol, as Lane was referring to. You could wear a sword to gatherings, and there have been many purely ceremonial and dress swords not intended for combat. But sitting down to dinner with a giant Guandao glaive would be awkward at best, ridiculous and threatening at worst. Well, that's excellent, and thank you for that. I'm a mace man myself. It's not really the gentleman of weapons. It's more like the brute thug of weapons. But that's what makes it so effective, right? You don't need to be specially trained in a mace. No one gets nicked by a mace, you know. If you get hit by a mace, that's probably the end.
Yes. I do think that White does believe what he says. The chauvinism is quite deep. And he's the mixture of a kind of very well read but also quite narrow in perspective. It's indicative of the English public school boy education. You know, they read everything, extremely well read, but with a very narrow philosophical point of view that is not to be questioned, but taken for granted. I've had a chance to think back to the first comment, though, about reading suggestions.
Oh, please.
To add into the mix with those. The first I would recommend is Blood and Money by David McNally. Blood and Money. The subtitle, War, Slavery, Finance, and Empire. Mm-hmm. Really excellent materialist account of those things. The Origin of Capitalism by Ellen Woods, which places it in 16th century England and really is an excellent showcase of how to do a kind of materialist account of these kinds of things. Liberalism, A Counter-History by Domenico Lusordo, which was recently translated into English. And then also A Legacy of Violence by Caroline Elkins, A History of the British Empire, Legacy of Violence. All of these would be more materialist rather than idealist accounts of the same set of concerns.
Thank you for that. Now, we had one comment there in the middle, and I would like to put, I don't know if this is White actually believing it, so I'm going to push back on Drew just a little bit, and that is his reading of 19th century scientific racism backwards to kind of portray the English-Celtic feud as nationalist. And I think this is White responding to the demands of his time rather than... I don't think that he thinks that... He's too well-read, especially as a medievalist. White was a very capable medievalist. He certainly knew that they weren't nationalists in the 8th century, right? That the idea of nationalism as such did not exist. But remember that he's dealing... I mean, the proximate cause of this book in many ways is to address the rise of National Socialism in Germany and the threat that it poses to the rest of the world, communism in Soviet Russia, fascism more generally in Italy and across Europe. And he's thinking of these kind of things, and he's identifying a key cause of it as nationalism, which he sees as coming out of the Great War. The major cause of the Great War is nationalism, and it's the proximate cause of the Second War as well. So he really wants to address this and identify it as a major problem, and then his Arthur has to grapple with it. This is not a historical reading of the Arthurian mythos, right? Nationalism is not the cause of strife in the 8th and 9th centuries. There are other similar causes, we might say, but they're not nationalistic qua nationalism. Does that make sense?
Well, and yet he's quite blind to English nationalism. He doesn't like the violence. He's critical of that,
Yes.
and he's critical of adventurism. But he takes English um, imperial nationalism as a kind of a natural thing. He takes it for granted that they should be the the group in charge of the Isles. These are just sort of facts of nature, not something to be criticized in the way that Nazism is criticized.
Yes. Although I'd say we could also blame his source for that. He's writing a book about Arthur, right? And Arthur has to be the sort of perfect central figure, and he by and large is. White even scrubs stuff that turns up in Mallory, where Arthur isn't quite presented so well. He has to make Arthur perfect, right? To put him at the center of this story, that's what makes the tragedy of it work. So it's probably not the right kind of a story for a critique of Arthur, and of the British Isles, at least as Arthur conceives of them, which are utopian, purely utopian in nature, and not, I think, really real. And if there is a criticism, it's that it doesn't work in the end, right? Arthur's conception for a utopic British Isles ultimately fails. So maybe there's a latent criticism there, if not an overt one.
Yes, but it's one he doesn't know what to do with. I mean, the way that it ends, the reflections Arthur has at the end are basically, we did our best, we couldn't have done better. We don't know exactly what went wrong.
Well, because that's Mallory, right? I mean,
Yeah.
in the end.
Well, I mean, it doesn't exactly excuse everything to say it's in Mallory, because he's quite content to deviate from Mallory when it serves his didactic purpose, and other times not. So it's an interesting mixture of faithfulness and appropriation of Mallory for his own. I mean, he clearly has a point he wants to make.
Yes. I just don't know. I mean, can you make a point about the ultimate cause with the Arthur that he's created? And I think the answer.
Well, I think that's the problem.
Yeah,
By the
I know.
end, he says you can't.
Yeah, you can't. I think I tend to agree. Like this Arthur, the one he's created, he's kind of painted himself into a corner, and you can't really. There's no grounds for critique here.
You can almost see him painting himself into the corner as the books go on.
Yeah.
I mean, there's much more confidence in the project in The Sword and the Stone, and then by the end, when we hear Arthur musing on his own legacy, you realize White has no idea how to get out of the problem he's created.
Maybe that's in my view, that's far more powerful than all the didactic messages in the text.
Oh yes, yes.
Because it really drives home the point that you can have all these beautiful ideas and structural plans, and they can lead you absolutely nowhere and leave you even unable to identify where you went wrong. Right? You're so blinded by the systemic world, utopic world you've created, you can't even figure out where it went awry. The whole thing seems to be implicated.
Yeah, there's a refreshing honesty in that final scene.
Maybe it's White's honesty as well. He doesn't know. Nobody knows, maybe, but White at least is fully willing to admit at the end, I don't even know where I went wrong, but it doesn't work in the end. All right.
Do you think he changes his mind in trying to write the Book of Merlin?
Oh, maybe. I don't know that the Book of Merlin really gives us any answers either. It gives us a personal answer, which is an important life lesson, which is how do you live with ultimate failure? At the end of everyone's life, you ultimately fail. There are things you cannot complete. There are things you would like to do that you can't do, first through infirmity and then through death. How do you face that and not despair? And I think that's what the Book of Merlin is about, more than any political ideology, right? It's to confront all these things you think you should have done, and then to realize, well, those probably wouldn't have worked either anyway. And I just wasn't up to the task of saving the world on my own. Well, nobody is. That's a task too big for anyone. How do you deal with that? There's no political answer to that question. And maybe the danger is thinking that there is a political solution to this problem of humanity, that we can't actually save the world. All right. Well, with that, we're going to turn to Lancelot's madness. That's what the sequence is often called in Mallory. It's what we're going to call it here. What do we have to say about it? Well, it's an interesting parallel, what we get here, to the part of the text that comes after it. We have set up for this week and next week 2 portions of the text. This week is Lancelot's madness and his eventual recovery. Next week is the quest for the Holy Grail and its eventual discovery. Both of these sections of the text are told through vignettes that are then related to the court. The first set of vignettes are the sightings of Lancelot and whispers about him, and then his recovery, and he makes it back to the court, and then we have a sort of second denouement, right? We had the first one where Elaine comes to Camelot, and that is occasioned by the death of Lancelot's reason. We have a second denouement when Elaine again comes to Camelot, and she does this by committing suicide and having herself put in a barge and floated down the river. And that ends her involvement, although not entirely, because the product of her and Lancelot's relationship becomes the way that the next set of vignettes is resolved, and that is the quest for the Holy Grail. It was Mao, I think, right? Or was it someone else? I think it was Mao who mentioned it's great how Galahad sort of is like the ghost. You don't really see him. You hear whispers of him. Sort of wisp-like. Mordred is eventually described this way. In next week's episode, we'll talk about that. But it's interesting that this product of Lancelot and Elaine's union is so hard to pin down. Like Lancelot himself, I suppose. But not ugly.
And like nature. And the nature of their union is extremely hard to pin down, as becomes clear in this week's reading. The author seems almost ambivalent about the question of whether or not Elaine is to be pitied or to be blamed for the way that she initiated their attachment to each other.
It is hard. And you would think it wouldn't be, because it's straightforwardly rape, deception, misrepresentation. The tools she employs are deplorable. And yet, the way that she is portrayed, the person using these tools, makes her a pitiable figure. And you want to almost excuse it. Remember when we found her, she was being boiled. She was the girl in the boiling vat. Boiled alive. That was her curse. And Lancelot did a miracle and rescued her from it. So you can sort of see, like, there's something not normal about her right from the beginning. And you can then sort of say, well, how could this person having this life behave according to the normal expectations of human society? She spent her life in a boiling vat. This has clearly warped her perception of how to behave in some way. So she's obsessed with Lancelot. And then we might fault her. At least we can understand her. It's actually like Melville writing about Stonewall Jackson. You remember we did that way back when? You could deplore the ideals for which he stood, but don't deplore the bravery of the man. And I think we have a similar dichotomy with Elaine, where we deplore what she does, but we feel pity for what she has been and what she has had to suffer and what it's done to her. And in last week's episode, when she confronts Guinevere, she is right. I mean, she tells Guinevere the truth in the end, which is a very dangerous thing to tell a queen. But I don't like Guinevere very much, so maybe this colors my view. But it's agreeable to see someone basically say, your husband is King Arthur. What do you need with someone else? Why can't you just let me have him? And you were right to point out, Drew, that he wouldn't necessarily go with her anyway. But you can see why Elaine would say that because, her husband is King Arthur. What does she need with anyone else?
But again, that was an arranged marriage. She didn't choose Arthur. And she, to her credit, she does see that Arthur is admirable, and she loves him in that way. But she's never been in love with him.
Yes. Well, she's in love with Lancelot. That's the problem. And this is the part where we can think back to that comment about maid marriages tending to work out. I think White is grinning when he says that, right? He's too good a student of history to think that for real. There's too much counter evidence. When they work out, they do work well. But, they don't often. At least, in the central example, really, is it the only example we get in the text? Yeah, it's the only example of a maid marriage in the entire book. It's not just a failure; it's a colossal failure. It's a failure that brings down the realm. So White has to know that.
So well, that's interesting. The narrative does undermine his straightforward statement in the narration.
White is a sort of jokester. If you haven't figured that out from reading the book, it's there everywhere, right? He likes making jokes, and he has very dry wit. And I think sometimes this goes by. That comment about the Plantagenets is absolutely a joke. Good, clean fighting. No, absolutely not.
There's a maid marriage that worked out very well.
It did. That one did work, right? Yes.
It worked out well when he put her in the Tower of Salisbury and kept her locked up.
Well, you get the heirs, right? And you get the land, and then you put the wife away in a tower, and that's it. And then it works if you compartmentalize it, literally. Well, let's talk about. I really want to go to. Was it chapter 19 where they're talking about? Yeah, that's where I have it in my book. I have my bookmark in there. They're talking about Lancelot, and this is the part that Drew mentioned. They describe him as being very ugly. Actually, I'm gonna hand this over to Drew to read. His eyeballs were bright red. Yes, this is it. King Pelles. Would you be so good as to read this passage, Drew? I'm still recovering from a respiratory illness, and I keep coughing, so it's best if I didn't.
Sure. Where do you want me to start?
Let's see. You could start with their discussion. Just after that, where they talked about the wild man, and there's a back and forth discussion between Bliant and Pelles.
Yeah, this is Sir Bliant speaking. I am sure he must have been a gentleman. He kept doing things which nobody but a gentleman would do. He had a natural leaning to arms. Where is he now? Said King Pelles. God he knows. He vanished one morning when the hounds were at Castle Bliant, but I am sure he was a gentleman. They sipped and gazed into the flames. If you want to have my opinion, added Sir Bliant, lowering his voice, I believe he was Sir Lancelot. Nonsense, said the king. He was tall and strong. Sir Lancelot is dead, said the king. God be good to him, everybody knows that. It was not proved. If he had been Sir Lancelot, you could not have mistaken him. He was the ugliest man I've ever seen. I never met him, said Sir Bliant. It was proved that Lancelot ran mad in his shirt and breeches until he got gored by a wild boar and died in a hermitage. When was that? Last Christmas. It was about the same time that my wild man ran away with the hunt. Ours was a boar hunt too. Well, said King Pelles, they may have been the same person. If they were, it is interesting. How did your fellow arrive? It was during the summer questing, the year before last. I had my pavilion pitched in a fair meadow in the usual way, and I was inside it, waiting for something to turn up. I was playing chess, I remember. Then there was a frightful row outside, and I went out, and there was this naked lunatic lashing on my shield. My dwarf was sitting on the ground, rubbing his neck. The maniac had half broken it. He was calling out for help. I went to the fellow and said, "Look here, my good man. You don't want to be fighting me. Come now, you lay down your sword and be a good chap." He had got hold of one of my own swords, and I could see that he was mad straightway. I said, "You ought not to be fighting, old boy. I can see that what you need is a good sleep and something to eat." And really he did look dreadful. He was like a man who had been watching a passenger for 3 nights. His eyeballs were bright red.
Let's stop there for a moment. Well, I think it's very clear. If there were any doubt about Lancelot being ugly, this is Pelly's view, right? That he was the ugliest man he ever saw. Lancelot rescued his daughter, so he's got good reason to be nice about Lancelot, if he can. So I don't think there's any doubt that Lancelot as a grown man is ugly. So this is where you have to wonder then, is he really ugly or not as a child? And that's where your reading comes in. I think it's tragic either way. It just depends on how you get to the tragic end. And this episode is tragic too. So I think we can definitely conclude from this that the wild man that Sir Bliant finds is definitely Lancelot. It's not ambiguous at all, really, is it?
Yeah.
Especially at the end, where he becomes an object of pity. They ask, how did it end? And he basically takes his horse and rides off with it, right? I think the word that Bliant uses, something like, he was excited by the idea of knightly pursuits or something like that, right? That it awakened something in him. And this reminds me of how Arthur's often talking about games mania, right? The sort of obsession over knightly contests that the knights have in the Round Table. This idea of being excited by knightly pursuits. I guess something inside of you, and it just kind of comes out and leads you to this exuberant display of taking someone's horse and riding off on it. Where is that? I think it's at the end of the chapter. Yes, they're at the hunt, and the boarhounds came to the castle, and one of the followers left his horse and spear by a tree. The wild man took them and rode away. It was as if he were excited by gentlemanly pursuits, as if a suit of armor or a fight or a hunt stirred something in his poor head. They made him want to join in. And then King Pellas is more or less convinced. Poor boy. It may well have been Lancelot. Of course it was Lancelot. The whole pitiable episode in chapter 19, despite the pathos of it, is meant to portray Lancelot because he's got the knightly speech. He's very good at arms, right? He's beating on a shield when they find him, right? He's just thrashing on it. He wants to fight. He has to get it out of him. And I think this is where we can see Arthur later on being quite right, that for his conception of the Round Table, for the people he has to work with, that has to be channeled. It can't be suppressed. Because even when he's mad, Lancelot is still doing these things. He's still fighting, trying to do knightly, contests.
It's a good example of White's very dry wit here. When the wild man, next thing he did was to throw away his sword and rush straight into the pavilion. My poor wife was there in bed with no clothes on. But he just jumped straight into bed with her, snatched the coverlet, rolled himself up in it, and went fast asleep. King Pellas said, "Must have been a married man."
Indeed. Well, he is married in a way, right? I mean, for all intents and purposes, He's not going to cheat on Guinevere knowingly.
As we know from the musical, had he been made the partner of Eve, we'd be in Eden still.
Well, let's see. Shall we skip ahead to 21? In the next chapter,
Well,
Pellas works out that it is indeed Lancelot. But in chapter 21, we get Elaine again.
and so there's a nice contrast here. We have the picture of what happened to Lancelot. He went mad. Then we have the picture of what happened to Elaine in the meanwhile, and she has become a nun. You have quite a poignant picture here in the first paragraph. Elaine had done the ungraceful thing, as usual. Guinevere, in similar circumstances, would have been sure to grow pale and interesting. But Elaine had only grown plump. She walked in the castle garden with her companions, dressed in the white clothes of a novice, and there was a clumsy action in her walk. Galahad, now 3 years old, walked with her, holding hands. White's quite good at painting this, these pictures that carry a lot of meaning in them, and that's one of them.
Absolutely. I think it's Elaine doing the ungraceful thing really sums up her character, right? And it's another reason why we can feel pity for her, because you don't learn airs and graces if you're spending your life being boiled in a vat. You can't go to finishing school. It's difficult to focus on other tasks when you're being boiled in a vat. So she's not a graceful person. But also, and maybe this comes from being boiled in a vat and not having any experience of the outside world, she is absolutely frank with people. Now, she's not always entirely forthcoming. She'll hold things back, right? Or she'll say things in ways that cast a certain shade on the things that, on the events that she's describing. But she never actually lies. And she is very direct. And it's her directness with Guinevere at the end of last week's section that I found so refreshing. And now, when Lancelot turns up in the garden of her nunnery, and he's just there under a tree, resting, and her father comes to visit her, as a king might do, pip off to the nunnery to visit your daughter. And she says, well, there's Lancelot under the tree. Only then does Pellas really acknowledge that the wild man is Lancelot, and any ambiguity is discovered. So we might say, in a way, that it's Elaine who saves him. She's there for him to be a refuge near her. It might be the way that she kind of can be redeemed in our eyes as readers. She's sort of the cause of his madness. Actually, let's push on that. Is she the cause of his madness? What causes Lancelot's madness? We've talked about it. Why does he go mad?
It's the contradiction in himself that he holds in his mind. It's his own internal psychology. He can't resolve this vision of himself as needing to be perfect with his own self-loathing.
It's a manifest and gross imperfection. Sleeping with his best friend's wife, committing adultery with his king's, his liege lord's wife, and he's supposed to be the best knight in the world.
But again, it's not like Arthur. Arthur has known about this the entire time. Merlin's flat out told him, by the way, your best knight's going to sleep with your wife. That's just a thing that happens. Get used to it. So Arthur never really seems to be aggrieved by it, and you'd think that would be, Lancelot and Guinevere being like, well, Merlin already said this, why deny fate, and be a little more gentle on themselves, but, I guess, expectations of the courtly romance don't let them do that.
I think he is aggrieved by it, but I think that he feels a great deal of pity for both of them. he doesn't feel as if they're doing it to him or doing it on purpose. He feels as if they're both caught in something they can't control, and therefore he can't really be mad at them.
And at the same time, he has to subsume for Arthur his the personal wound that he feels he suffer in favor of a greater purpose, which is the survival of the Round Table and the stability of the kingdom. And he believes that both Guinevere and Lancelot are essential to those projects.
There also seems to be an unspoken agreement. As long as they don't make it too obvious, as long as they don't make it beyond doubt, then he will act as if nothing is going on.
Yeah, he has to have plausible deniability, right? That's the thing. It takes us to Mallory's, the king had a deeming of it. Even in Mallory, Merlin tells Arthur at the beginning that Guinevere is going to sleep with Lancelot and betray him, just as he does in White. But in both cases, by the time we get to the end, we're only told that the king had a deeming of it. And that word means like a kind of knowledge, but not a certain knowledge.
White paints this as a picture as well, the deeming, in a scene at the table where he looks up from his soup and the two of them are looking at each other with madness in their eyes, and he knows exactly what it means. And rather than saying anything, he looks back down at his bowl.
Yes, a sort of studied avoidance.
Yeah.
I'm not going to pull at that thread. I'm not going to pursue that because he has a deeming of what's going on. And if he knows that if he investigates it, it won't be a deeming, it'll be a certainty, right? So he's not going to pursue those sorts of leads. And that's, of course, what Mordred works out. He realizes, because he's very crafty, what is going on. And he discovers that the way to solve this is just to put it before the king in a way that the king can't look away anymore. They force him to deal with it. And, of course, we get to see what happens when that is done. And whether that's a critique of Mallory or White or the larger tradition is a matter for discussion when we get to it. But to come back to Lancelot's madness, what's the proximate cause? So there's this internal conflict that Lancelot is trying to square. He's brought before Guinevere. He's got Elaine there. Do either of them bear responsibility for what happens? If so, whom and to what degree?
Well, I mean, the most proximate cause is Guinevere losing her temper and telling him that she can't trust him and doesn't want to look at him ever again. Which, of course, is not the case.
No.
She, of course, will want to look at him again, but that's the way she's responded in the moment. And he has a tendency to take things very literally and absolutely. And I think he does in this case as well.
I wonder why that is. And it seems entirely in keeping with the character as we've seen him painted, that he would have this very literalistic, that when someone says, I don't want to see you again, it means I don't want to see you ever again. It doesn't mean I'm angry and right now I don't want to see you, but tomorrow I may feel differently. It's just, it's an absolute, right? As if it came from heaven. Maybe because that's how he is, right? When he says something, he really means it. He would never tell anyone, I never want to see you ever again, unless it were true. And maybe that's what makes his response to Elaine so devastating when he tells her that he's not interested in seeing her, he wants nothing to do with her. He really means it. And the fact that she keeps kind of trying to get back into his life or keeps ending up in his life must be really, aggravating for him because he doesn't want her around. It's only seeing Galahad that changes his mind about his own son.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that this is, and so in reading these, I also read the biography of White that came out after his death by Sylvia Townsend Warner, and learned that Lancelot was a little bit autobiographical for White. And so I think that this is probably some of White's own self-image bleeding into the text here.
I can't think of a
They
character
both.
I'd like less to be like in the entire book than Lancelot. He's
But that's part of it. I mean, White had, as the biography notes, a streak of self hatred, just like Lancelot. So at some point, this is him chastising himself. And I think one of the things mentioned in the biography was he was not always lucky in love, and so
Well,
he
and he was.
probably had a bit of the same disease here.
It seems as if White was tortured about his own sexuality, um, which is
So
the case with Lancelot too.
yeah, that was the biographer Sylvia Townsend Warner. That was her read of it, that he was an unacknowledged homosexual. And then, of course, White's friend and editor responds to the autobiography by saying, like, how dare you? You should have gone to talk to any of his numerous female lovers. And so I think that the answer there that both of them dance around is that, and this is written in the 1960s, so he may have been somewhere along the spectrum in bisexuality, and they just didn't have that as a concept and couldn't resolve it. And that's what
But
led to a lot
his
of the back and forth.
Yes, and there were other people who responded to the editor's response and said, "No, I'm quite certain he was." Um, but you remember his own note that he wrote. He kept these notebooks on Mallory, and on his notes next to the ill-made knight, he said, "Is it possible that someone could be ambisexual or bisexual?" I mean, he acted like it was this unheard of category.
Well, and for the time that he was in it, it really was. There wasn't a solid concept of that.
Well, if we look at Elaine, um, and imagine her as sort of this intrusive female sexuality, kind of dominance and unmans Lancelot, and takes away his ability to do miracles anymore, at least as far as he thinks, right? Then there is
Well, and
something,
also she forces herself into his life.
yeah,
I mean, he says quite explicitly, "I do not want a child. If you have a child because of this rape, then that's your child, not mine." So you can see why he's got very complicated feelings about Elaine.
so to lose Guinevere's affection over this woman with whom he really never wanted anything to do with her, and she tricked him and raped him. Uh,
And I think it does drive him completely bonkers that Guinevere refuses to believe that he doesn't have feelings for Elaine. I mean, she's
Absolutely.
convinced that he wants Elaine as bad as Elaine wants him.
And
Uh,
he's not seeing, because he can't get inside Guinevere's interiority. He's not seeing why Guinevere thinks that, because of the child. Like that's if he were more sensitive to that, he'd realize, like, the fact that Elaine has his child is what is really getting Guinevere's goat here.
The fact that Guinevere can't have a child.
Yes.
they they all kind of fail to misunderstand each other's motivations.
Yeah.
But I think that the proximate upshot for Lancelot is what Drew has just put his finger on, which is that Guinevere cannot imagine that Lancelot is accidentally unfaithful. It's too fantastical for her to believe, considering the presence of a child. And this leads her to be especially harsh with him and untrusting. And in his view, he has been absolutely frank and totally honest. And he's told her up front, look, this was an accident. It was not deliberate. I want nothing to do with this woman. And if you look at from his position, that's correct. He has never betrayed Guinevere. He has been, as soon as he knew what was going on, he got away from Elaine. He never pursued anything with her. He was absolutely frank in saying, I want nothing to do with you. This child is not mine. It's the sort of thing that if Guinevere were aware of it, you would think that she would be very pleased, right? That his rejection is so total and absolute, and his faithfulness to Guinevere is so completely impervious to criticism. But because she's not aware of all of that, and because of her own doubts and mistrusts, which come out of her barrenness, and because of the way that Elaine presents it, which is not the whole picture, but also not false, these things, collapse into this moment where she doesn't believe him, and yet he has suffered so much. I mean, he's been raped, and the person that he loves most does not only doesn't believe him, but turns against him.
I think there's an element of projection in Guinevere's response as well. I mean, she knows that her infidelity is quite purposeful, and she has a hard time imagining Lancelot's as accidental. Because she does feel guilty.
Yes, especially when he goes mad. She is then moved by pity, and she is concerned about him. Well, let's, as we're coming to the end of the episode, it's time to look at the end. The end of Elaine, which we see in, what is it? Chapter 25, isn't it? He leaves Elaine with a huge sum of money, but he does leave her for the raising of Galahad. But
It's also it takes Elaine less time to realize that he's going to leave than it takes Lancelot himself to realize that he's going to leave. And she asks him for specific instructions about how Galahad is to be raised, which drives Lancelot crazy. So, why are you asking me about this? I'm not going anywhere. She already knows.
I want to look at this section where after Elaine commits suicide, and I'm trying to remember in which chapter that takes place. Do you recall, Drew?
He leaves in 24.
And then 25 is where we have the 15-year jump.
8. So maybe it's in 26? No, it's not 26.
I don't see it in my notes for 26.
Maybe this is something that was revised in The Once and Future King, and we never see her die. But it's quite... If he revised that away, that's a fault. No, maybe he did. Maybe in the Once and Future King version, he took that chapter out.
Surely not.
Because I'm at 34 now, and I still haven't found it. So yeah, it looks to be that he's revised this out of the Once and Future King. This is a terrible mistake, if so. So I guess we can talk about this, because it's not in the Once and Future King. And I'll tell you what happens if you're reading the Once and Future King and you don't know that in the Ill-Made Knight there was a chapter that's in there, and it, instead of Lancelot leaving Elaine a ton of money, we get the Elaine of Tennyson and Mallory, and she commits suicide. And her body comes down the river in the barge, and it's brought to the castle. And this is where we were supposed to end this week. But I wasn't looking at my own copy.
It's in chapter 40, isn't it?
Is it in chapter 40? Wow, they've moved it that late?
Yeah, it's in chapter 40.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it is still there, but it's been moved a ridiculous length. It's been moved about 20 chapters. So it's supposed to be around chapter 20, 25, which is why I originally set up this. But I wasn't looking at the Once and Future King. I was looking at the Ill-Made Knight when I set this up. So they've moved this chapter. So I think that's a mistake. I wonder why they did that. Why did White do that? Why did he move it after the Holy Grail? That's strange. It's supposed to occur before the Holy Grail. In any case, we'll talk about it when we get to chapter 40. Instead, we get to talk about this parting gift to Elaine, which is not, I think, in the original Ill-Made Knight. So this is something that was interpolated instead. He added this chapter and then moved Elaine's death.
Maybe because Lancelot can't go on the quest for the Grail if the most recent act that he has done has led to someone's suicide.
Yeah, maybe. He leaves her. She's alive in this version. She's not dead. He's acquitted himself decently, right? He's given her a huge sum of money in this version of the text. Well, let's read the end of that chapter, which is chapter 24. And it says this. He did not look back as he rode away from Bliant Castle, and Elaine, standing on the Barbican Tower, did not wave. She watched him going with a still-struck concentration, like someone who, shipwrecked, gets as much fresh water into her little boat as possible. She had a few seconds left to make her store of Lancelot that must last her through the years. There would be only this store and their son and a lot of gold. He had left her all his money, enough to bring 1,000 pounds a year for life. In those days, a huge sum. I'm sorry, it's such a weak ending compared to what I think we'll get in chapter 40 of this version, which is that the suicide of Elaine and her coming down the river. But the idea of her storing things up is carried over. Because that's how that chapter on Elaine's death goes on, is that she was made to fit Lancelot, and Lancelot was made to fit her. The narrator tells us that they were kind of meant to be with each other. And yet she never really got to see him her whole life, only just a handful of times, and she had to make that last. And then she tried to do so, and eventually she ran out of oomph. She couldn't make it last anymore, and so she just had to stop. That was all she had lived for, was for Lancelot. And when it was clear he wasn't coming back, and when Galahad had gone too, then it was time to die. Maybe that's why we have the break. But I mean, how old does Galahad have to be at that point then? It's 15 years. So I mean, Galahad's about 15 at this point. Then we have to have another break? Well, I guess it's only for the Holy Grail. She dies after Galahad? I don't like that. I don't like her dying after her son has attained the Holy Grail. But for extremely complicated reasons that I won't go into on the podcast because they won't be of much interest to anyone. But I don't like that.
I think one of the most touching scenes in The Ill-Made Knight is this one right here in 24. This conversation just before Lancelot leaves, but before he knows he's going to leave. Elaine detained him as he went down to the boat. "Lancelot," she said, "what do you want me to do with Galahad if you should go away?" "Go away? Who says I'm going away?" "Nobody says so, but I want to know." "I don't understand what you're talking about." "I want to know how Galahad is to be brought up." "Well, I suppose in the usual way. He will learn to be a good knight, I hope, but the whole question is imaginary." That is what I wanted to know. She detained him once more, however. "Lancelot, will you tell me one other thing? If you should go away, if you should have to leave me, would you be coming back?" "I have told you I am not going away." She was trying the meaning of her words, and as she made them, like a man walking slowly over a bog and feeling in front of him as he went, It would help me to go on with Galahad. It would help me to go on living if I knew it was for something, if I knew that one day, if I knew that you would be coming back. Elaine, I don't know why you are talking like this. I'm not trying to stop you, Lance. Perhaps it would be best for you to go. Perhaps it is a thing which has to happen. Only I want to know if I should see you again, because it's important to me. He took her hands. If I go, he said, I will come back. The man on the other side of the moat was Uncle Dap. He was standing with Lancelot's old charger, now 2 years older, and all his accustomed armor neatly stowed on the saddle, as if for a kit inspection. Of course he does. He goes.
Because he gets the
But
helmet.
he didn't know. She knew.
Oh, well, that's the thing. Somehow she knows, right? That at some point in the future, he's going to encounter Guinevere somehow, and that'll be it. And that's exactly what happens. And there's a series of disconnections, right? Like we're talking, we're with Lancelot, we're with Elaine, and then Uncle Dap is there. He's standing on the other side of the moat. He's got Lancelot's helmet, and then Lancelot has the helmet in his hands. And he's turning it over, and he sees the embroidery on the mantling, the little fleur-de-lis. And he recognizes the embroidery. And he picks it up and he sniffs it. And what does he have? Guinevere is there in the room with him. He can smell her. Real Jenny. Not angry, yelling. But real Jenny. And then the next image we have is him riding away. Right? Nothing else. It's just instant. For us, literally instant. It happens instantaneously. He's riding away in the very next image, and that's when Elaine's on the barbican watching him. So White does a wonderful thing there where he speeds up time and omits all the stuff in between in order to make Lancelot's feelings about what he'd like to do into reality. He reifies them, right? Lancelot would like to leave him, but of course there are things he actually has to do. He has to get dressed. He has to get his horse. He has to tell Elaine that he's going. But all of that gets elided just so we can see him riding away in the very next sentence. That's how swift Guinevere's pull is on him. And Elaine knows that. She knows it all along. And Lancelot doesn't even know it. You're quite right. I think that's a fantastic section of the text.
He also he lies to her. He doesn't mean to. He doesn't know he's lying, but he doesn't come back.
He doesn't come back, and he does leave. The idea of me leaving is imaginary. No one said I'm leaving, right? But she knows better than he does the kind of relationship they have, which she should. She's the author of it. She should know it better. Well, we're going to stop there, and next week, Lancelot will return to court, and he'll be feted by Arthur and Guinevere, and they will attempt to deal with the problem of might versus right. What do you do when you run out of giants to slay? Where do you channel all that might? Stay tuned to find out. Now, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can head over to criticalreadings.com and click Become a Patron at the top of the page, and that will get you into our Discord subscribers-only chat. It provides for all of our podcasts to be online and ad-free, and it also provides for you to have that invite where you can participate in these chats and our discussion forums, and you can see the podcast recorded live if you wish. You get early access to the podcast as soon as they're through editing, and you get to vote on our Listener's Choice episodes. And we'll have those, I think, every year before and after our summer reading. So one is coming up. So head over to criticalreadings.com and click that Become a Patron button today. We'll put your name in the credits for as long as you're a supporter. And thank you also this week to Lane Haygood.
Goodbye, as always.
And Dr. Drew Nathaniel Keene.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm Dr. Sean Philip Cooper, and this has been Critical Readings. Until next week, from all of us here, Godspeed.